Nobody is claiming credit for what just burned to the ground in Lorestan province. That silence is the story. When the United States Air Force destroys a target, U.S. Central Command releases the footage. Strike package executed, direct hit confirmed, secondary explosions visible. The footage goes public within hours, and the operational message is deliberate. We did this, we will do it again, and there is nothing you can position, camouflage, or harden that we cannot find and eliminate. American military transparency about kinetic strikes is itself a psychological weapon, a constant broadcast of capability and intent aimed at the IRGC's institutional confidence and the Iranian leadership's political will to continue. But the Polac petrochemical refinery in Iran's Lorestan province is burning right now with nobody claiming the fire. No CENTCOM statement, no airstrike footage released, no missile tracks on radar, no aircraft overhead in the operational window when the blaze started. The provincial governor's office confirmed the explosion and fire. The footage is real. A wall of flame and black smoke so total, so complete, so consuming that Iranian emergency teams described the blaze as severely complicating containment efforts, which is the official language for a fire so overwhelming that the firefighting response has been rendered functionally irrelevant. The facility is not damaged. It is gone, vaporized in a fire that the Iranian government confirmed, that provincial officials confirmed, that the footage confirmed, and that nobody in the American or Israeli intelligence community has publicly acknowledged executing. That gap between the confirmed destruction and the absent claim of responsibility is not a mystery. It is a methodology. And understanding that methodology, understanding why certain targets in Iran burn without warning, without attribution, without any of the public signature that accompanies the aerial strike campaign, is the key to understanding the full architecture of what is being applied to the Islamic Republic right now. Because what the world can see is only half the picture, and the half it cannot see may be the more strategically consequential half. But let's back all the way up, because to understand what a burning petrochemical refinery in Lorestan province actually means in the context of everything else happening right now, you need to understand two things simultaneously: what Polac was producing, and why it sits inside a pattern that stretches back well before the current round of open hostilities began. The Polac refinery is not a civilian fuel processing plant. The word petrochemical, in the context of the Islamic Republic's military-industrial complex, means something very specific and very different from the consumer energy framing that the word carries in ordinary coverage. Petrochemical facilities of the type operating in Lorestan province are the upstream supply chain for Iran's entire weapons manufacturing enterprise. Rocket propellants for ballistic missiles, produced from petrochemical precursors. Explosive compounds for warheads, derived from petrochemical processing chains. Motor casings for ballistic missiles, manufactured using polymer compounds that petrochemical plants produce. Sealants and adhesives for drone airframe assembly, petrochemical outputs. Rubber gaskets that maintain the integrity of pressurized propellant tanks and missile bodies, petrochemical products. The specialty polymer coatings that protect electronics and guidance systems from heat and vibration, petrochemical derivatives. Every single weapon system the IRGC has deployed in this conflict. Every ballistic missile fired toward Jordan and Iraq and the Gulf states, every Shahed drone launched at commercial shipping and American military positions, every cruise missile aimed at targets across the regional theater, was assembled using materials that facilities like the Polac petrochemical refinery exist to produce. The refinery is not peripheral to the IRGC's weapons enterprise. It is foundational to it. It sits at the upstream origin point of the supply chain that builds the IRGC's offensive inventory. Destroying a missile launcher eliminates one weapon. Destroying the petrochemical facility that produces the propellant for the next 100 missiles eliminates 100 weapons that haven't been built yet, and the 100 after that, and the 100 after that, across the full production cycle that depends on that facility's chemical outputs. That is not the same kind of military effect. It is a categorically deeper and more strategically consequential kind of damage, and it was accomplished without a single aircraft entering Iranian airspace to do it. Now here is where the pattern becomes the story. Because the Polac refinery fire is not an isolated incident. It is the latest confirmed instance in a pattern of unexplained explosions, mysterious fires, and infrastructure destruction events at Iranian military and military-adjacent facilities that has persisted throughout every phase of this conflict without pause, before the open fighting began. During the ceasefire that temporarily suspended direct military exchanges, and now, as the ceasefire has officially ended, and full-scale American aerial operations have resumed at their highest tempo since the conflict started, these fires follow a consistent targeting logic. They do not appear at random civilian facilities. They do not appear at the kinds of targets that would generate maximum civilian casualties and thus maximum international condemnation. They appear at facilities with direct documented relevance to Iranian military production capability, the upstream supply chain for weapons manufacturing, the industrial infrastructure that sustains the IRGC's ability to replenish what the aerial campaign is destroying. And they appear at moments of maximum operational significance, not randomly distributed across the calendar, but timed in ways that compound the pressure being applied simultaneously through the visible aerial campaign. That is not coincidence. That is coordination. The invisible campaign is synchronized with the visible one in ways that suggest a single operational planning process, determining the timing, sequencing, and target selection for both tracks simultaneously. And the message of that coordination is more alarming for the IRGC than the destruction itself. Because the IRGC can look at radar screens and see American aircraft approaching. It can hear the sound of incoming munitions. It can track the operational pattern of CENTCOM's aerial strikes well enough to disperse assets and harden facilities against the predictable elements of the air campaign. What it cannot do is detect the ground-based operations that are moving through its facilities without any of the electromagnetic signatures that air defense systems are designed to detect. It cannot know which facility will burn next. It cannot know when. It cannot know who is inside the perimeter. And it cannot know, after the fire starts, whether the person who started it is still inside Iran or has already left. That uncertainty, the persistent, unresolvable uncertainty about an unseen adversary operating inside your own borders with apparent access to your most sensitive military-industrial facilities, is a psychological weapon that the aerial campaign, for all its devastating effectiveness, cannot deliver on its own. Now let's address the political architecture that is running on top of both the visible and invisible military campaigns, because the statement that President Trump posted on Truth Social in the hours surrounding the Polac refinery explosion is a strategic document that demands to be read with the analytical attention it deserves rather than the headline treatment it has mostly received. Trump's statement announced that the Islamic Republic of Iran has asked to continue talks and that the United States has agreed to do so, but that the ceasefire is over, the word over in all capitals. The apparent tension between those two simultaneous positions, we will talk to you when your ceasefire is finished, has generated considerable commentary about contradiction and mixed messaging. That commentary misses the strategic logic entirely. There's no contradiction in that statement. There is a strategy. A deliberate, structured, psychologically sophisticated, dual-track strategy that does something very specific. It keeps the diplomatic door nominally open precisely so that when Iran refuses to walk through it, the United States can say without any credible rebuttal that every available pathway was offered, every opportunity was extended, and the Islamic Republic chose the military confrontation over every alternative that was placed in front of it. That framing matters. Not for domestic audiences alone, although the domestic dimension is real. American public opinion about the sustained use of military force against Iran depends partly on the perception that non-military alternatives were genuinely exhausted before the bombing intensified to its current level. It matters for international audiences, for Gulf Arab partners whose cooperation the United States depends on for basing, logistics, and diplomatic cover, for European allies whose energy security is directly affected by the Strait of Hormuz situation, and whose political support for American military operations in the region depends partly on the narrative that the U.S. was not the side that refused to negotiate. The statement is designed to build the record, to document in real time and in public that talks were offered, that the door was open, and that the IRGC chose to keep attacking rather than engage the diplomatic alternative. And then, when that record is complete, when the documentation is sufficient to make the case that Iran had every opportunity and chose none of them, the diplomatic track closes entirely, and the military option becomes the acknowledged exclusive instrument. We are now in the phase where that record is being built. Iran's response to Trump's statement was entirely predictable, and in a certain sense, deliberately so. Iran's Fars news agency immediately denied the reported talks, with a source close to the Iranian negotiating team calling the claims of finalized preparations false and no basis in reality, insisting that any developments would come only through official Iranian channels. That denial is not a statement of substance. It is a statement of form. Iran is not saying there will be no talks. It is saying it will not allow Washington to define the terms, timing, and framing of whatever communication is occurring. It is protecting the narrative architecture that allows the regime to describe any eventual diplomatic engagement as happening on Iranian terms rather than under American military pressure. Because the optics of negotiating under fire are existentially problematic for the IRGC's institutional legitimacy. An institution that is publicly committed to a multi-stage escalation response, that has declared the Strait of Hormuz under Iranian control, that has told its own population and its regional proxy network that it will fight until one side emerges victorious, that institution cannot be seen to be sitting across from American diplomats while American bombs are falling on its facilities without its own constituents, concluding that the institutional narrative was a performance rather than a commitment. So Iran says publicly, there are no talks. while in Qatar, where American diplomats and Qatari intermediaries are reported to be active in the back channel that has historically served as the communication conduit between Washington and Tehran, when official channels are closed, messages are moving. Not negotiations in the formal sense, not structured diplomatic dialogue with agreed agendas and official delegations, messages. And one of those messages, from the American side, is the same message that the Truth Social Post delivered publicly. The ceasefire is over, the bombing will continue, and the terms for any eventual outcome will be shaped by the military reality that American strike packages are generating on the ground inside Iran every night. That is negotiating with bombs, literally, operationally, and as an acknowledged strategic doctrine being applied in real time. Now let's talk about the aircraft carriers, because their position at the moment the ceasefire ended communicates more about American operational intentions than any diplomatic statement could. The USS Abraham Lincoln is confirmed approximately 150 miles off the Iranian coastline, pushing north. Pushing north means pushing toward Iran, pushing toward strike range. The USS George H.W. Bush is confirmed at approximately 162 kilometers, also pushing north on the same vector. Both carrier strike groups moving simultaneously toward Iran. In the immediate operational window following the official announcement that the ceasefire is finished, carrier strike groups do not reposition without purpose. Moving a carrier is not a casual operational decision. It requires extensive logistical coordination, fuel planning, air wing briefing, strike package preparation, and the full orchestration of a floating airbase and its associated destroyer and cruiser escorts. When both carriers in the theater move simultaneously toward the Iranian coastline within hours of the ceasefire being officially declared over, that is not a coincidence of scheduling. That is a deliberate positioning decision made by the command authority responsible for executing whatever comes next. Both carriers pushing north means the number of aircraft available for strike tasking against Iranian targets effectively doubles compared to a single carrier operational posture. The sortie rate doubles. The sustained strike tempo the American military can maintain over multiple consecutive nights of operations doubles without requiring additional land-based airfield support or extended transit distances that eat into time on target and weapons load capacity. Two carriers within strike range of Iran simultaneously is the operational posture of a military force preparing for an expanded, sustained, high-intensity campaign rather than a discrete strike package with a defined and limited endpoint. The flight radar confirmation of multiple refueling tankers already airborne over the Persian Gulf adds the final operational layer. Tankers up means fighters up. The aerial refueling architecture that extends fighter range from a few hundred miles to a theater-wide strike capability that can reach deep into Iranian territory and return to the carrier. That infrastructure is already functioning, already airborne, already integrated into an operational framework that can generate strike packages against Iranian targets without additional warning or preparation time. The fighters can be turned toward Iran at any moment the execute order comes through. The operational machinery to sustain that turn through multiple sorties and multiple nights of operations is already in place and already running. This is not defensive positioning. This is strike-ready posture. And the Iranians' radar screens, their satellite imagery, their intelligence services tracking American naval movements, all of them see exactly what the flight radar data shows. The message requires no translator. Now let's address the dimension of this conflict that has received the least serious analytical attention relative to its strategic significance. The personal targeting threat against the highest value American individual in the theater, and what the Iranian state's institutional response to that threat reveals about where the Islamic Republic's decision-making calculus actually stands. President Trump confirmed to the New York Post that he has left specific contingency instructions for action in the event that Iran succeeds in its documented plot to assassinate him. The instructions, as reported, are 4 words in substance. Bomb them at levels they have never seen before. The New York Post reporting describes these as formal, left-in-place instructions. Not a rhetorical threat issued in the heat of a press conference, but an operational directive recorded in the official record, to be executed automatically by whoever assumes command authority in the event that the directive becomes relevant. In the context of a conflict that already involves Tomahawk cruise missiles striking the Bushehr nuclear facility, CENTCOM executing strike packages of 140 targets in a single night, and both carrier strike groups pushing toward Iranian waters. The phrase, levels they have never seen before, is doing enormous work. It implies a category of response that exceeds the current campaign in a way that the current campaign, for all its documented devastation, has not yet reached. The Iranian state's institutional response to this threat has not been to de-escalate or deny. An Iranian lawmaker named Saveti has called on Parliament to fast-track legislation specifically targeting Trump and other U.S. and Israeli officials, a legislative process designed to transform what is currently an operational IRGC program into an act of the Iranian state, endorsed through the formal legislative apparatus of the Islamic Republic, enshrined in Iranian law. CNN has separately reported that Israel passed Washington unverified intelligence about a possible Iranian assassination plot against the president, and the operational security response to those threat assessments has been visible and documented. Air Force One switched aircraft variants during a recent departure from Turkey, moving to an older variant with superior defensive systems. Passengers aboard were directed to close window blinds. These are not precautionary protocols triggered by general threat environment assessments. These are specific behavioral and equipment changes made in response to a threat assessment credible enough to alter the operational procedures governing how the President of the United States travels. When the security apparatus responsible for protecting the Commander-in-Chief changes the aircraft he flies on and closes the windows of the plane around him, it is not doing so because of theoretical concern about general Iranian hostility. It is doing so because the intelligence picture justifies those specific, operationally significant changes, and Trump confirmed it directly on camera, acknowledging he is number one on Iran's kill list and that he is aware of the threat assessments driving the changed security protocols. A banner hung in Mashhad, a city of religious and cultural significance in the Islamic Republic, where public displays at scale require institutional sanction, reading, "We will kill Trump," is not spontaneous popular expression. In the governing environment of the Islamic Republic, a banner of that size in that city, making that specific declaration, is an institutionally tolerated message. Its presence tells you something about what the Iranian state apparatus is willing to publicly endorse regarding the assassination of the sitting president of the United States during an active military conflict. These two realities, the presidential contingency order to bomb Iran at levels never seen before, and the Iranian state apparatus publicly tolerating city-scale assassination declarations against the president, exist simultaneously in the operational environment of July 13th, 2026, and they create a risk scenario that sits entirely outside the conventional military exchange analysis framework, not the risk of another IRGC missile salvo or another American strike package. The risk of the conflict's entire escalatory structure being reset instantaneously by a single operational event that neither side can confidently prevent, and both sides have been unable to definitively rule out. Now let's build the convergence analysis, because the individual tracks of this conflict, the aerial campaign, the ground sabotage operations, the carrier positioning, the diplomatic dual track, the assassination threat, are not parallel stories. They are simultaneous pressures bearing on the same adversary at the same moment, and their convergence creates effects that none of them could produce independently. The military track has now encompassed 3 consecutive nights of American strike packages, totaling more than 300 confirmed Iranian military targets, with the third night alone, Strike Package 3, hitting 140 installations in a single operational cycle. Air defense systems degraded to the point of irrelevance for manned American aircraft. Coastal radar and surveillance architecture progressively blinded. Ballistic missile launch infrastructure targeted and destroyed across multiple launch sites. Drone production and carrier facilities burning in Bushehr province. IRGC fast boat fleet reduced by close to 100 vessels, confirmed across recent strike cycles. Naval base installations across the southern coastline systematically eliminated. The railway bridge in Lorestan province connecting Iran's resupply corridor to China, severed. The Bushehr nuclear facility struck by Tomahawk cruise missiles. The IRGC airport in southeastern Iran taken out. And now, running alongside all of that, the invisible track that the aerial campaign cannot claim, the Polac petrochemical refinery in Lorestan province, gone in a fire that nobody officially lit, taking with it the upstream chemical supply chain for the next generation of Iranian ballistic missiles and drone systems that the aerial campaign was destroying the previous generation of. The combined effect is not additive, it is multiplicative. Destroying the launched missiles and the launchers simultaneously with destroying the facilities that produce the propellant for the missiles that haven't been built, yet creates a compounding degradation that cannot be reversed by any measure available to the IRGC within the operational timeframe of this conflict. The magazine is being emptied, the factory that was filling the magazine is burning, and the supply chain that feeds the factory is being severed at multiple points simultaneously by operations that cross multiple domains and operate in multiple spaces that no single countermeasure can address. The financial track is compressing the Iranian state's room for maneuver from the revenue side at precisely the same moment the military track is destroying the assets that the revenue was sustaining. The Strait of Hormuz, through which Iranian crude must flow to generate the foreign exchange that funds the IRGC's entire enterprise, is now operating under conditions of active American military campaign rather than the IRGC's extortionate control. The insurance premium environment for tankers transiting the region has fundamentally changed in ways that raise the cost of global energy commerce and simultaneously reduce Iran's ability to market its own crude at competitive prices. The Iranian state's financial reserves, already under sustained pressure from years of sanctions and economic mismanagement, are now being consumed simultaneously by the cost of an active military campaign and the revenue losses from a maritime corridor no longer under Iranian coercive control. The psychological track is operating at unprecedented intensity across multiple audiences simultaneously. The Iranian civilian population is experiencing power outages in the southern provinces, watching petrochemical plants burn in Lorestan, hearing air raid alerts in areas previously considered safely removed from the conflict's kinetic reach, and absorbing the accumulated psychological weight of an institution, the IRGC, whose public declarations of dominance and control have been operationally refuted in real time and in sequence across every domain in which it made those declarations. The Iranian political establishment, the clerics, the technocrats, the institutional actors whose support the supreme leader's authority depends on, is watching a military institution it was told could hold the Strait of Hormuz, deter American military intervention, and absorb limited strikes without existential consequences, reveal itself as unable to prevent the systematic dismantling of the military infrastructure it built over decades, unable to maintain even a 60-day commitment to maritime non-aggression under the terms of a memorandum of understanding it signed, and unable to deliver on any of the public commitments its commanders and chief negotiators issued through official institutional channels. Credibility is the IRGC's foundational strategic asset. It is what converts Iranian military capability into Iranian political influence across the regional network of proxies, partners, and client states that the IRGC has spent decades cultivating. When credibility bleeds at the rate it is bleeding in this conflict, the strait declared closed while 800 ships transit it, the era of one-sided deals declared over, while Strike Package 3 eliminates 140 more targets. The assassination threat publicized while the security apparatus protecting the American president changes his aircraft and closes his windows. The proxy network that watches all of it is making its own calculations about what IRGC commitment and IRGC protection are actually worth in the strategic environment that is emerging from this conflict. Those calculations, made in Beirut, and Sana'a, and Baghdad, and Damascus, are the long-term strategic consequence of the psychological track that no missile intercept count and no target tally can fully capture. Now let's go inside the Iranian command structure with the analytical depth that the situation requires. The Islamic Republic's response to the combination of the ceasefire announcement and the Polac refinery explosion has followed a pattern that reveals the internal political dynamics operating under the surface of the official statements. The public denial of talks, Fars News rejecting the reported diplomatic preparations as having no basis in reality, came from the institutional voice most closely aligned with the IRGC's interests. That is the hardline institutional voice, the one committed to the narrative of defiance, the one for whom any acknowledgement of American diplomatic overtures represents an admission that the bombing is generating leverage that the IRGC's military posture cannot neutralize. But the back-channel communications through Qatar continue. Different actors, different institutional voice, different calculation about what the trajectory of this conflict means for regime survival. If the only response is continued military escalation against an adversary who has publicly committed to getting larger with each successive strike package. This institutional split between the IRGC's public voice of defiance and whatever quieter voices inside the Iranian political system are generating the back-channel diplomatic traffic is the most important unobserved variable in understanding where this conflict goes from here. Because those quieter voices cannot gain institutional traction inside Tehran, as long as the IRGC's public commitments make any form of diplomatic engagement look like surrender. And the IRGC's public commitments cannot be honored militarily, given the operational reality of what 300-plus confirmed targets and a burning petrochemical refinery in Lorestan actually represent for the Iranian military's sustainable capacity to continue the fight at any level approaching the rhetoric the IRGC is using to describe it. The gap between the public commitment and the operational reality is where the most dangerous decisions in this conflict will be made, not the carefully calculated decisions reviewed by senior political leadership and subjected to institutional deliberation. The reactive decisions. The decisions made at the operational level by IRGC commanders whose facilities are burning, whose communications are degraded, whose chain of command is fractured, and whose institutional mandate to escalate is running up against a military reality that cannot support the escalation it mandates. That gap between what the IRGC has publicly committed to doing and what its actual military capacity can deliver is the structural condition that produces the miscalculations, the unauthorized actions, the disproportionate responses taken without senior political authorization, that convert a controlled military exchange into something that nobody in the system planned and nobody in the system can halt once it begins. Here is the honest strategic assessment for July 13th, 2026. The United States is simultaneously dismantling the IRGC's military capability through confirmed aerial strike packages, while conducting a parallel invisible campaign of infrastructure sabotage that is attacking the upstream supply chain for the weapons, the aerial campaign is destroying the current inventory of. Both carrier strike groups are pushing north towards strike range of Iranian territory. The diplomatic track is being maintained at minimum functional threshold, specifically to build the record that Iran refused every alternative before the military option was fully exercised. The presidential contingency orders for an Iranian assassination scenario describe a response that exceeds the current campaign in a way that the current campaign has not yet reached. And the IRGC's institutional leadership is trapped between public commitments it cannot operationally honor, and a diplomatic engagement it cannot publicly accept without destroying its own institutional credibility with the constituents whose support its authority depends on. None of that is a picture-approaching resolution. None of that describes the operational conditions that produce a negotiated settlement within the next 48 to 72 hours. What it describes is a conflict in the most dangerous phase of its trajectory, the phase where one side's military capability is being systematically reduced below the threshold required to sustain its public strategic posture, while the political constraints preventing that side from adjusting its public strategic posture remain fully intact and are in fact hardening rather than softening under the military pressure. The Polac petrochemical refinery is still burning in Lorestan province. Nobody has claimed the fire. The facilities that process the chemical precursors for Iran's next generation of ballistic missiles are gone, consumed in an inferno that provincial emergency teams cannot contain and that the Iranian government has confirmed without being able to explain. And somewhere inside Iran, in a facility that sits on no publicly available target list, that appears on no CENTCOM strike package briefing, that has not yet appeared in any analyst's assessment of what America's next move looks like, someone is reading a list and making a decision about which one burns next. The invisible campaign does not announce its targets in advance. It only announces them after the smoke is already rising. And the smoke over Lorestan is rising too high and too black and too complete to leave any doubt about what it means for the IRGC's capacity to build the weapons that the aerial campaign has been destroying. The ceasefire is over. The carriers are pushing north. The fighters are in the air. And the fires that nobody claims are still the most consequential fires burning in Iran right now, because the ones that cannot be seen are the ones that cannot be defended against.